Hello, I'm Ray Cormier, and thanks for joining me today on the latest episode of Books and the World. This show is a presentation, as most of you know, of the Cape Cod Writers Center, and today we're really going to focus sharply on the Cape, particularly one iconic town here, with our guest, Rick Cochran. Rick is the author of two memoirs, Wellfleet Tales and Wellfleet Tales 2, Confessions of an Washashore. And now he has published Murder at Bound Brook, Cape Cod Mystery, a novel set in a town that very closely resembles Wellfleet. Welcome to the program, Rick.
Thank you, Ray.
And before we start, congratulations and thanks for joining the board of the Cape Cod Writers Center.
Thank you.
Now, as I understand it, you live in Hull on the mainland, but your affection for Wellfleet on the Outer Cape stems from your spending most of your youth there. Is that right?
That's correct. And just one minor correction. I live in Hull. You could call it the mainland, but with this nor'easter coming this weekend, it might be a little damp. We live right on the beach there, so you can take the boy away from the beach, but you know, I'm still found another beach.
Okay. So how long did you live in Wellfleet?
My family moved back there. They had lived there for 5 years before I was born. That they moved back there when I was 4 years old in 1952. My father became the teaching principal for the second time of the Wellfleet Consolidated School. Mm-hmm. And then I lived there until 1970 or 71 when I graduated from college and my father passed away and my mother sold the house in Wellfleet.
Oh, okay. So what is it about Wellfleet that makes it such an attractive subject for your writing, do you think?
Well, my wife describes people and who go to Wellfleet and Wellfleet people who now call themselves Fleetians as a cult. And I think it is a bit of a cult. I think every town on the Cape, in a way, has its own cult because people really, love their individual towns. But I think maybe the isolation, maybe the need to be self-reliant, all of those things I think brings out a special thing. Also, I think the Cape Cod National Seashore has preserved a lot of the old Cape, and so it hasn't become as developed or commercialized as many areas of the Cape. And so you can get a real feel for what Cape Cod always felt like.
Mm-hmm. While you have that affection, what actually made you want to write about it? You mentioned in one of your books, I think your first book, that your mother's death was a catalyst, right?
Yeah. My mother passed away at age 95 in 2006. Mm-hmm. And, sort of reflecting on her death and the death of my father, more than 40 years before that, more like 20, now it's been over 40, but made me look back. And I also inherited a number of boxes of Wellfleet and Wellfleet High School and Wellfleet Consolidated School memorabilia. Mm-hmm. And I kind of felt a bit of an obligation to share that. More than just turning it over to the Historical Society. So I did a very crude memoir, which hopefully my few friends I gave it to will never show it to anybody else. But they encouraged me to do more with it. And I realized that what it really was a collection of anecdotal, stories. I come from a family of storytellers. My family, my wife and kids will cringe and tell you that I am a storyteller. Mm-hmm. They probably heard many of them more times than they wanted to. And so I started writing short stories and submitting them to some friends, and they said, you should put it out somewhere. I found a guy who did a Wellfleet blog, and he started publishing them online, and I got a bit of a following, and finally after about 30 stories, someone said, when are you going to do the book? And I said, well, yeah, I guess I should put them in a book. So I did.
Oh. Very good. Now, in the first book, Wellfleet Tales, you write, and I quote, Wellfleet is a beautiful town with a rich history. However, it is not utopia. And then you say, and it had its share of tragedies and scandals. Mm-hmm. So my question is that what you had in mind when you decided to write Murder at Bound Brook? Yeah.
What I really wanted to do was capture a realistic feel for Wellfleet, and I decided not to call it Murder at Wellfleet because I thought it might be, if it was too close to, people would try and make parallels to things that had happened. So there's a village or a section of Wellfleet which once was its own village called Boundbrook. And so I came up with the name Boundbrook. For those on the inside, they'll know that that's a Wellfleet name. But so it's really funny because the book itself, without going into spoilers, it's a murder mystery. There's also a lot of tragedy in it. And yet a lot of people who read it, comment about, how good it made them feel. And I think there's a lot of, positive relationships, and there's also a lot of tragedy in it. And, isn't that what life's all about, and certainly what it's like in a small town.
Right. So the reason you didn't set, you actually admit in your post novel notes that there are a lot of similarities to Wellfleet.
Yeah, it's kind of Wellfleet.
Yeah, I was curious why not put it in Wellfleet.
It gave me a little more literary license to make a few minor adjustments. And also, I changed some names in there. And because I didn't want to, but I'll be flat out about it. Two of the biggest, most common names in Wellfleet when I was growing up were the Taylors, and there were many, many Taylors, and the Paynes, and there were many Paynes.
Right.
Some with just the last name Payne, and there were other people who were just Paynes, but forgive the joke. But I didn't want to actually use the actual names because I thought people might get distracted trying to figure out if that was actually supposed to be one of the real people. Mm-hmm. And the same with just not specifically using the name Wellfleet. But I think people who write, we collect incidents in our mind, and they're floating around in the back of our mind. And the opening, which, of the story involves a fire and the death of Old Man Proctor. And I remember reading a blog about South Wellfleet, believe it or not, the history of South Wellfleet. And in 1938, the winter just before my family first moved to the Cape, to Wellfleet, before I was born, there was a fire in a blizzard, and Old Man Payne died in the fire. And probably caused by a kerosene lantern back in 1938. But I remember thinking to myself, yeah, but what if it wasn't an accident?
Right.
And when I went to write the murder mystery, I thought, that's going to be my opening,
Okay. But you moved the setting up to February of 1952.
Yes.
And the fire that begins the story takes place during the blizzard that is quite famous for the wreck of the Pendleton off the coast, off Chatham, and the rescue of the ship's crew by the little Coast Guard tender that went out there.
Yep.
So, and then you bring into this this mystery that begins with a death in the fire. A fellow by the name of Rob Caldwell as your hero.
Right.
He's a World War II veteran, local basketball legend, who's called on to assist in the investigation because he had a little bit of police background from his
as an
war
MP
years.
in the military, right?
How much of that character grew out of your imagination, and how much of it might be based on people or person you might have known?
Most of it grew out of my imagination, and the Rob Caldwell character, I came up with that because his initials are RC, but I didn't want it to be Rick Cochran, and and I didn't want to come up with a real old Cape name. Once again, I wanted it to be somebody no one would kind of go, oh, is that supposed to be this one or that one? And I think as a young boy, I grew up on the Chip Hilton sports series, which was kind of like the Hardy Boys for sports people. And so Rob Caldwell is a little kind of like an updated Chip Hilton, kind of the all-American boy. And yet, as we find out right in the beginning, he's had a difficult life. He was initially raised by a single mother with, kind of a scandalous background, and then was orphaned at a young age. And so, he doesn't have a perfect life, and yet his family, the Tyler family, extended family, brought him in and raised him, and it's kind of like a little bit like he was raised by a village. But he finds his calling with the only sport that the little town had, which was basketball. And being 6'3" and athletic and kind of a little chip on his shoulder, it gives him an outlet to to succeed. and then be able to move out into the larger world, you know, as a recruited basketball player.
Right. And he eventually brings some of that outer world back to town with him.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, he does. And just one little thing, the basketball was also because my father, who became the teaching principal at Wellfleet Consolidated School, had been captain of the Tufts basketball team and had been a star basketball player.
Right.
And then actually later in the 40s, when he left Cape Cod, he coached Tufts University during the war years and actually took Tufts to the NCAA basketball tournament where they lost to Kentucky. So it was a little bit of an homage to my father also with the basketball.
Yeah, yeah. But you point out too that basketball was really the main sport in these little towns because they just didn't have enough boys sometimes to
It was frequently the only
have other
sport.
sports.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, you only needed, you know, 5 guys and some subs.
Right.
And, you know, baseball, you needed 9 and, you know, a couple of scrubs maybe. And especially in the spring, a lot of those high school boys would be out after school, sometimes during school, shell fishing with their fathers.
Sure.
And so, you know, they wouldn't always make baseball practice. But in the winter, they were kind of a captive audience.
Right. Now, Murder at Bound Brook is, like the other 2 books, is a paean of sorts to small-town America.
Right.
But besides the violence of the murder in the book, Rob is haunted, literally and figuratively, by his experiences in Marseille, France,
Right.
after the war. The consequences follow him back home. So more so than your memoirs, Murder at Bound Brook seems to also have a theme that a small town can't truly shelter its residents from the pressures that you also have in big cities. Is that fair to say? And was that your intent?
Yes.
In some ways?
Yeah, I think partly the Marseille connection, which involves a romantic interlude as well as kind of a villainous figure, was a lot for the drama. But I think also in 1952, I selected 1952 partly because of that famous blizzard with the Pendleton wreck. And by the way, the skipper, the coxswain of the Coast Guard boat that made the rescue, and his wife was from Wellfleet. And he ended up living in Wellfleet for a number of years and was the harbor master in Wellfleet just before I worked there as assistant harbor master one summer. But it also was in the year of 1952. The Korean War was going on, so people, you know, would have been drawn into that. McCarthyism and you know, the anti-communism scare. Communism scare was at its height. So there were a lot of things that I tried to, you know, bring in to create a real feel for what would be, you know, going on and even affecting a small town.
Right, and in that regard, you actually have a character, a shady minister, Duggan, I believe the name is, and preaching to his flock that it's a Christian's duty to defend Senator McCarthy in his quest to defeat, you know, communism in the government.
Right.
So those national, international concerns come into play in this little town.
Yes.
As remote as it is. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then interestingly, you have a lot of little cultural references from history in the book, things like movies, references to schools on the Cape that no longer exist.
Right.
How much research did you put into this novel?
Well, you know, I believe because I taught history and I'm a history person, and also as an avid reader, you know, I want to make things historically accurate. As you caught, I did move one movie up by a few months on its release because I kind of needed that movie to extend the theme of a romance and a romantic triangle. But many of the things growing up on the Cape and knowing the Cape and you know, coming back to the Cape, I knew, but I also double-checked everything. One of the big things too about 1952 was the Cape was on the verge, the outer and lower Cape was on the verge of becoming the big tourist mecca that we know today. And what had held it back was transportation. And in 1952, the new Route 6 was finished through the town of Wellfleet. I don't think it actually made it all the way to Provincetown until that summer. Before that, it was a winding, twisting road. Most of it is the remnants of what's now 6A, and it took forever to get to the Cape. So, you know, I needed to research when did it really get finished, you know, and found out it had been finished just before the winter of '52 and made it through Wellfleet. So there were a lot of things I needed to check out, particularly nationally and historically. Most of the Cape things I knew, but I also kind of double-checked them.
Having done the 2 memoirs probably helped a great
Absolutely.
deal. You had done a lot of the research for those, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And how long did the actual writing take for the novel?
You know, as a lot of writers can relate to, that's hard to say in a way, because I could almost say I wrote in 3 months, but that wouldn't really be true, because I wrote an initial rough draft of it about a year before. But each time that I did sit down and write it, I kind of, I'm not a writer who sits down and writes an hour every day. I'm more of an obsessive writer. When I'm ready to do it and I'm on a mission, you know, I might write for 8 or 10 hours a day, and, you know, for like a couple of weeks. And so I think that Murder at Bound Brook was a couple of 3-month binges, separated by about 8 months in between.
Okay. So for those who may not have read them, tell us about the 2 Wellfleet tales, how those came about and how they differ a little.
Mm-hmm. What happened is my mother, at the age of 95, passed away in 2006. And I think a lot of people can relate to how that's a time of reflection. And so I started thinking about, you know, our life growing up on the Cape, or my life growing up on the Cape. And I also inherited 2 or 3 big boxes of memorabilia. And the vast majority of it were pictures and class photos and team photos of the old Wellfleet High School and the Wellfleet Consolidated School. For people to understand is, Wellfleet Consolidated School was grades 1 through 12 in one building.
Okay.
And my father taught math and sometimes science, and when he first was hired, he taught about 3 other subjects too. And he also was the principal. And so I had all of this memorabilia, and I felt I needed to share it beyond just giving it to the Wellfleet Historical Society. And so I started, you know, incorporating them into kind of a memoir, and then they turned into stories. And the books are short stories, most of them with a little humor, usually with me being the one with the egg on my face, falling in the harbor or whatever. But they also include a lot of old historical photos of the town and in people and institutions. And I actually tied a few of the things together. I did an article a few years ago on the old Chequesset Inn in Wellfleet, and Lorenzo Dow Baker, who was a Wellfleet boy from Bound Brook Island, who became the founder of what today is Chiquita Banana United Fruit Company. And he was a big benefactor to the town of Wellfleet. And he built this huge inn out on a dock over Wellfleet Harbor, just below the house I grew up in.
How long ago was that?
That was in the late 1800s, about 1886, and it burned down in 1934 in another winter blizzard, believe it or not. It didn't burn down, I'm sorry. That was an old misconception. The ice flows and the winter damaged the pier and ruined, you know, the inn. But then I worked that into Murder at Bound Brook, because my character who dies in it, Old Man Proctor, right in the beginning, dies in the house fire. A lot of his wealth came from a inn, very similar in concept to the Chequesset Inn, except with a more illicit clientele. So a lot of things kind of, you know, piggybacked off each other, with them being changed a little bit for the fiction novel.
Right, right. So that helped a lot. Okay, and has anyone ever come up to you, I'm just curious, to complain about any depictions in the memoirs, or disagree with your memory of it, or
No.
anything like that?
No, no. One of the things I think as a writer that's been really gratifying to me is that I think of myself as being a relatively terse in my writing style. I certainly have descriptions of things, but I don't go into great detail about flora and fauna. partly because I don't know a lot about flora and fauna and all of those kinds of things. And yet, I had people who would say to me, and most do, they say, I loved your description. I could really get the feel of, Cape Cod in the winter. I could smell the salt air. And a couple of them said, I loved that scene where you had the people taking and lining their winter boots with plastic bags and so on. And I thought, oh, thank you. And then afterwards I thought, I didn't write that. And what I realized was that, and this is what I like to do, and I guess I succeeded, is write enough that the reader can become engaged and in their own personal memory fills in the voids. Sure. And to me, that's the best thing a writer can hope for, because then that tells me that the reader has really owned the story and made it their own, and then, kind of morphed their memories together with the story's descriptions, right, and think it's real,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As a wash ashore myself,
well, likewise.
I'm going to ask you to explain this.
Well, that's true.
You have a in Wellfleet Tales, the first book, you have a section titled "Who's a Cape Native?"
Right.
So please tell us who is and is not, and why, and how you found out, because I found that fascinating.
All right. Well, first of all, in the old days, my father always knew, and we knew, that we were not natives, because in the old days in the Cape, it was like in Vermont, which I lived in for a few years. You had to have been born in the Cape, and your parents, both of them, had to have been born on the Cape for you to be a Cape native. Now, my sister Judy was actually born on the Cape in Wellfleet at Cape Cod Hospital, so technically in Hyannis, when they first lived in Wellfleet before I was born. But she wasn't a native because my parents hadn't been born there. And so we were technically wash ashores. And one of the things with me growing up in town is that I was a townie, but I wasn't a native. And what I realized later, and I didn't even realize growing up, is how many of the kids who were my friends were all cousins. And I joke with some of my friends now when I'll post things on Facebook, and he'll say, oh, that one's my cousin and that one's my cousin. And I'll say, were there any people in town who weren't your cousins? And he goes, not many. But when you go back about 10 generations in one town, it's pretty good chance that those people are cousins. What I discovered, though, and is my claim to not totally being a wash ashore, is that I did ancestry and genealogy, and I discovered that 3 of my 10th great-grandparents were founders of towns on the Cape. 2 of them founded Barnstable Town. The Reverend Joseph Hull and Lieutenant Thomas Dimmick had the charter to found Barnstable. And the Deacon Doan was one of the 7 founders, the 7 families that founded the town of Eastham. And when Eastham was founded, it went from Harwich all the way down to Provincetown. And so in a way, my 10th great-grandfather founded the town of Wellfleet because that broke off from Eastham. So in the story, I'd say, so there, I really am a native, not just a wash ashore. Of course, I have to acknowledge that my family moved away for 200 years, but, we came back. That should count.
The roots run deep.
Yeah, exactly. It should count.
You were a teacher and a principal, an educator all your life.
Correct.
So when and why did you become seriously interested in writing? Was it really just getting involved with your family history and the Wellfleet history, or was it beyond that?
I've always had a feeling I wanted to write. And, I've dabbled at a few things here and there. As a history teacher and as a teacher, I'm a storyteller. And even up until a year or 2 ago, I would substitute teach at the local high school. And the kids, I'd come in and they'd go, oh, wow, you're going to tell us a story today? And I'd be like, sure, get your calculus done, which, by the way, I can't help you with.
Right.
And, if we got 10 or 15 minutes at the end, and I'll tell you a story. And I would tell them, things like why Boston gets their Christmas tree from Nova Scotia every year, which you'll have to look up on the internet, or, other pieces of historical trivia. And so being a storyteller and a history buff, and a very, very avid reader, and nonfiction, but also a lot of mysteries and action adventure. I just felt it was something that I should do, and kind of stumbling into the short stories and the memoirs gave me the confidence to tackle a murder mystery.
All right. So after these 3 books, so what's your verdict? Can you really go home again?
We can always go home, but it would always be the same. Don't expect it to be exactly the same.
Do you consider Wellfleet home?
I do.
Yeah.
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 I've lived in Hull for, a total of about 30 years. And yet, I consider it another home, but I don't consider it home. I think a lot of times when you've really been close to a place that you grew up your whole life, that you can remember, that's always our home.
Right. Right. One thing about writing, you talked about a little bit about that. Your writing routine, you say, is sort of spasmodic, is it?
That'd be a kind way of putting it.
So you spend a lot of time over a number of days. Do you break off? What's your routine?
I think it's funny because my wife, who's a retired school superintendent, we have in common that we think a lot of things through, and a lot of when I'm ready to write, in my mind, I've worked a lot of it all through already. So I may not get anything written for days, but my mind is working on it. And it would often be like the way I would do lesson plans. When I would sit down and do a lesson plan, bam, it was done, because I'd already been thinking about it for several hours. Okay. So and a lot of people, and being an educator, I know that we all learn and do things in different ways, whatever works for us. So for a lot of people, that would be something they might keep outlining and writing it down on paper and getting the rough draft together. For me, I do it mentally first.
We only have a few seconds, so tell our viewers how they can find your books.
My books are available on Amazon, and on Murder at Bound Brook is available on Kindle. I didn't do the other books on Kindle because there's just too much of collector item with photos. I think people would like to have their own copies. But also they're in a number of bookstores on the Cape, particularly the Outer Cape, Booksmith in Orleans, Brewster Bookstore, Wellfleet Marketplace, a number of other, Titcomb's has Murder at Bound Brook. So, they're not hard to find.
Good. Well, it was a good read. I really enjoyed it. And we thank you very much for joining us on Books in the World. And viewers, we'll see you next time.